Today we are celebrating World Communion. World Communion Sunday is a tradition that started in the year 1933, a year that was called the darkest year of the Great Depression, and a time when Nazism was on the rise in Europe. Reflecting on the beginning of this celebration, the founder, a Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh, said, "It was during the Second World War that the Spirit caught hold for this celebration because we were trying to hold the world together." Today, I feel like we are also trying to hold the world together. While we are not in the midst of a world war, there is a shockingly similar sort of brokenness that infects our globe. There is hatred, anger, and greed. There is despair that characterizes many of our local, national, and international landscapes and relationships. And this brokenness is something I think we also see in today's text. In today's text, we see a family, a bunch of family relationships, and all of them are in the process of being broken. It starts with a father, with Jacob, who plays favorites with his 12 sons, so that the sons, somewhat understandably, struggle with one another. There is precedent for this, although not justification. Jacob himself was a younger son who was favored by his father Isaac, and in fact, Isaac was also a favored younger son. All this favoritism led to continued enmity between brothers. So there is a complicated generational history of brokenness. On top of that, it didn't really help that when the older sons of Jacob were out working to preserve their father's estate, it seems that the younger brother, Joseph, was being favored, given clothing, allowed to daydream. Describing his dreams, Joseph says to his brothers, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There I was, binding up sheaves in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." At first glance, this just sounds a little wild. Got bundles of wheat dancing around each other and bowing down. But really what's going on here in Joseph's dream is a depiction of a radical reordering of the family system and the society. Sort of radical reordering that is frustrating, particularly for the older brothers who are supposed to be the top dogs. And honestly, I'm sure they thought this kid barely contributes to the family work. And here he is proposing a new family system in which we are going to bow down to him? Who does he think he is? Frustrated, angry, fed up, and feeling a little bit threatened by a new way of ordering their family, their community, Joseph's brothers find themselves unable to have a constructive conversation. Instead of having a constructive conversation, they find that they want to kill him, to get rid of this new idea for reordering society. So they say to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into the pits, and then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his radical dreams." It seems as though for those who are trying to hold the world together, for those who are navigating brokenness in our world, for those who choose to do so by maintaining the status quo, those who dream of a new way to order society are a real threat. But the oldest, Reuben, says, wait. Unwilling to kill Joseph, and yet at the same time unwilling to stand up to his brothers, Reuben comes up with a plan, a middle way. He proposes that they simply throw Joseph into a pit, making it appear as if he has been killed with the intentions of rescuing him later. But as the saying goes, a road paved with good intentions leads in the wrong direction. By not immediately condemning the other 9 brothers' problematic behavior, Reuben makes it possible for his brothers to sell Joseph off into slavery. Reuben is too busy trying to hold together his family, his parents, the radical dream of his younger brother, his other brother's opinions of him, his own sense of responsibility and respectability and order and some sense of peace. But in trying to hold everything together, he totally drops the ball. It reminds me of what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter from Birmingham jail, which starts out by saying that the greatest stumbling block to true freedom in this country wasn't the KKK, but, quote, the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Reuben mistook order or a sense of control or comfort for true peace, the sort of peace that would lead to freedom and all of them being together and to the healing of their relationship. Now, that peace would have been really hard won with some really difficult conversations with his brothers, but it would have come eventually. When we are trying to hold a broken family or a broken world together, I think making decisions based on our own sense of comfort and control is a very, very real temptation. And it is a temptation that might not explode your world, like an argument with his 9 brothers might have. But it does do a domino train of breaking relationships. Thankfully, this is not the end of the story, although that is where that chapter ends. Many chapters later, over the course of many years, we see a story of these brothers that provides a stark contrast to the story of brokenness perpetuating more brokenness. After some time, and as a result of a major traumatic event in their life, a famine, the brothers travel across continents in search of food. Their search for food ended with them coming face to face with their brother Joseph, the same brother that they sold into slavery. And it turns out that Joseph is doing well. In fact, he is the one who has the authority to provide them with the food and the resources that they need to survive. But should he give it to them after all they've done to him? In our world, our general wisdom says that Joseph should retaliate with a show of force or might, an eye for an eye, fair is fair. But taking a step back and looking at these things, this behavior just creates an incessant loop, a continued process that never ends. Each cycle of revenge forms a link in a chain that binds them to the evil we are trying to overcome in the world. This is not unlike the cycle of generational preferential treatment to youngest sons or enmity between brothers that we see at the beginning of this text. Remarkably, instead of an eye for an eye, Joseph says, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Joseph refuses to continue in the broken family system, the cycle of sin. Instead, he opts for forgiveness. While we Christians know that forgiveness is always the right answer, sometimes it doesn't sit well. I have to admit, I felt a little bit for Joseph here. That had to be really hard. Pastor and writer Nadia Bolz-Weber explains, of course, forgiveness offends our impulses for retaliation. Mercy always will. But that's the God revealed for us in Jesus. Like it or not, this is what we see at the cross. At Calvary, God allows our human system of scapegoating and fear and retaliation to play its natural course, which ended, as it always does, in the suffering of God. And in turn, God shows us God's system by not even lifting a finger to condemn those who put him on the cross, but instead proclaiming of all things forgiveness. At the cross, Jesus ends the cycle. He refuses to continue the broken systems of our world, the broken family systems. Nadia Bolz-Weber continues saying, maybe forgiveness is actually the opposite of saying that what someone has done is okay. Saying it's so not okay that I'm not going to absorb it anymore. And I simply won't be tied to it. So it's this idea that forgiveness isn't accepting the behavior, but rejecting the chains that hold us to that evil. But is that possible? I think the answer comes clear for us in Joseph's words. If you look back, Joseph doesn't start by saying that he forgives his brothers. He starts by pointing to the fact that God is ultimately the one in charge. Forgiveness is an act of fidelity to the kingdom of God and a defiant stance against the forces of evil, even the evil in our own hearts. When we forgive someone, it is not an act of niceness. It's not being a doormat. It's an act of fidelity to God's evil combating campaign. As we seek together to hold together a world that is broken by anger, hate, greed, our call is to participate in God's evil combating campaign. And if that's the truth, then holding this world together is not holding all the pain that we see in the world, the brokenness, is not what God calls us to do. As a part of God's evil combating campaign, we don't have to hold on to the evil. We combat it through the blood of Christ. For as John read to us from the book of Colossians, it is in Jesus Christ that we have redemption and forgiveness of sins, and in whom all things hold together. We do not have to hold on to the evil. But Joseph shows us we do have to hold on to one another. It's this sharing, it's this provision, it's this surrendering, that holding on to one another while rejecting evil, that I believe that we learn when we break bread together at the communion meal. Here in the bread and the cup, we see how to surrender to God, to depend on God as our sustenance. In describing the Lord's Supper, Jesus himself explains that this is where his blood is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Here at the table, when we break the bread, we see the ways in which brokenness gives way to life. Here we see how to come together from many different life circumstances, many different continents, and hold on to one another. So that is what we are going to do today. Just like Joseph invited his brothers to the abundance of life and food, so also are we invited to this meal where we experience the forgiveness of God. It is not my meal to invite you to. It is not your meal, even though you have your own individual packaged elements. This is God's meal. And God welcomes all those who accept God's forgiveness to join at this table of God's grace. So I invite you to prepare your hearts to experience the grace of God, the forgiveness of God that does not hold on to your evil, but holds on to you. Let us prepare our hearts by singing, "I'm going to eat at the welcome table."